Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You look at the concept of an absolute monarchy, and the image that usually comes to mind is this rigid, unforgiving pyramid.
Right, like a strict top-down structure.
Yeah, exactly. One person sits at the very top, handing down orders, and everyone below just sort of scrambles to execute them. The flow of power is a one-way street, right? Dictated by the sovereign, enforced by the military, and suffered by the masses.
The traditional command structure, the monarch speaks, the realm obeys, and any deviation is just treated as treason straight away. It is a model we see replicated across countless empires throughout history.
But when you actually delve into the sources covering the Joseon Dynasty, that rigid pyramid morphs into an incredibly dense, intricate web. The monarch is at the center, certainly, holding ultimate authority on paper.
On paper being the key phrase there.
Exactly. Yet they are immediately tangled in thousands of invisible threads. We are talking about a massive apparatus of bureaucratic oversight, relentless scholarly critique, and this intense moral philosophy that bound the ruler just as tightly as the ruled.
It represents the absolute definition of institutionalized tension. The architects of this government built a highly centralized system, yet they fundamentally designed it to constrain the very absolute power it was meant to serve.
Which is such an interesting paradox.
It is, yeah. They were terrified of unchecked authority, so they engineered a state where every action required a reaction, a review, and a philosophical justification.
And that tension is really the core of our deep dive today.
We are undertaking a highly detailed comprehensive examination of the government of the Joseon Dynasty.
This is part of our broader Korean history series.
Yes, exactly. We are looking at an administrative leviathan that ruled the Korean peninsula for over 5 centuries, starting in 1392. We are going to deconstruct this complex web of councils, specialized ministries, and internal watchdogs.
So we're looking at the whole machine.
The whole machine. The goal is to uncover how this system functioned on a daily, practical basis. From the highest royal court in the capital of Hanyang all the way down to the most remote rural village.
Well, to properly contextualize this, we have to look at the foundation. The year 1392 marks the transition from the Goryeo kingdom to the Joseon era. The founder, King Taejo, was a military general who overthrew the previous dynasty.
But he didn't just want a change of leadership, right?
No, not at all. He mandated a fundamental, sweeping shift in state ideology. Goryeo had been heavily influenced by Buddhism, and power was concentrated in the hands of a strong, entrenched, land-owning aristocracy.
So warlords, essentially.
Right. Joseon, by stark contrast, was built from the ground up on Neo-Confucianism. The goal was to replace rule by birthright with rule by scholarship.
Creating a meritocracy.
Exactly. Governed by men who had mastered moral philosophy rather than feudal warlords.
And the ultimate glue holding this new, highly structured society together was a text called the Kijunguk Taejun.
Yes, the Kijunguk Taejun, which translates to the Grand Code for State Administration. It was compiled primarily under King Sejong and finally promulgated in 1485.
So almost a century after the dynasty was founded.
Yeah, it took time to codify. You really have to view this document as the ultimate constitutional code of Joseon. It was not just a list of suggestions.
It was the law.
It codified absolutely everything. From complex agricultural taxation schedules to criminal law, all the way down to the exact rank, salary, and daily duties of every single government official.
So it provided the permanent, written, legal framework for this entire bureaucratic web we are about to explore.
It really did.
Let's start at the very top of that web, where the ultimate authority theoretically resided. We're talking about the king and the state council. Now, the texts state unequivocally that the king possessed absolute authority. But I have to push back on that definition.
Go ahead.
If you are a monarch, how absolute can you truly be if your every decision is bound by Neo-Confucian tradition, historical precedent, and the strictures of that Kaiguk Tajin we just mentioned?
Right. It's a very constrained form of absolutism.
The sources even note that a natural disaster, like a drought or a flood, was interpreted as a direct sign of the king's personal moral failing.
Yeah, this requires a shift in how we understand power. In the Neo-Confucian worldview, the monarch is not just a political leader. The king is the literal mediator between heaven and earth.
That's a heavy burden.
It is. If the realm experiences a severe drought, a catastrophic flood, or a widespread famine, the philosophy dictates that this is not merely an unfortunate meteorological event.
It's a cosmic performance review.
A cosmic performance review, yes. The universe itself is signaling that the king is failing in his moral duties to his people and to the heavens.
So what does a Joseon king actually do when it stops raining for 3 months? He cannot just decree a rainstorm.
No, he can't. He has to publicly demonstrate penitence. The king would reduce his own meals, actually removing side dishes from the royal table.
Wow, okay.
He would move out of his luxurious main sleeping quarters into a more austere building. But most importantly, he would formally seek criticism.
Wait, he would ask people to criticize him?
He had to. He would issue decrees asking his officials and even common citizens to point out his flaws. During these periods of natural disaster, critics were granted absolute immunity from prosecution.
So they could say whatever they wanted.
They could submit memorials to the throne detailing exactly how the king's policies or personal behavior were ruining the country, and the king was required to read them and reflect.
So the absolute power was tethered to an absolute moral responsibility,
Precisely.
which perfectly sets up the body that stood right next to the throne, the State Council, or Ujeongbu. Established in 1400, it replaced the old Goryeo Privy Council and served as the highest deliberative organ in the government.
The Jingbu was the apex of the civil bureaucracy. It was led by the 3 high state councilors, collectively known as the Cheongsing.
The top 3 guys.
Right, you had the chief state councilor, the Yinggijong, then the left state councilor, the Chwajong, and the right state councilor, the Ujinong.
And all 3 held the senior first rank.
Yes. Outside of the immediate royal family, this was the absolute highest level of status, power, and prestige achievable in Joseon society.
Their primary function was to deliberate on major state policy, review the proposals coming up from the lower ministries, and present a unified recommendation to the king for his final approval.
Exactly.
But here's my fundamental question about this dynamic. If the king is required by custom and law to seek the consensus of this state council before taking major action, who is actually running the country? Is it the monarch, or is it these 3 elderly scholars?
You have just identified the perpetual tug-of-war of Joseon politics. The balance of power was never static.
It fluctuated.
It ebbed and flowed depending entirely on the personality, political acumen, and raw strength of the monarch sitting on the throne at any given time.
But a strong king would handle it differently.
Oh, absolutely. Strong, ambitious kings like King Taejong in the early 15th century worked actively to centralize power. Taejong deliberately reorganized the government structure to bypass the state council on routine matters.
You just cut them out of the loop.
He explicitly required that all administrative decisions from the lower ministries come directly to him, reducing the Ujeongbu to a purely advisory body. He took the crank of the state machine and turned it himself.
So Taejong essentially told the council, I will ask for your opinion when I want it, but I make the decisions.
Precisely the opposite of how weaker kings operated. When a young, inexperienced, or simply disinterested king took the throne, the power vacuum was immediately filled by the Ujeongbu.
They stepped in.
During those reigns, the high state councilors were not merely advising, they were drafting policy, appointing officials, and effectively running the state. The king was reduced to a rubber stamp.
But the underlying philosophy stayed the same.
Yes, the prevailing philosophical belief of the dynasty always maintained that the state council existed to correct royal deviations from the righteous path, never to challenge the inherent sovereignty of the throne itself.
We can see this dynamic play out in the daily schedule of the court, too. The sources detail the rhythm of these interactions through formal and informal assemblies.
Right, the Sangchum and the Jokum.
You had the informal morning assemblies, the Sangkum, which were held daily. Then there were the highly formal assemblies, the Jokum, held on the 5th, 11th, 21st, and 25th of each lunar month.
The Sangchum, those daily morning assemblies, were intimate affairs. They were often held in the king's private administrative quarters.
Just a few people in the room.
The high state councilors and a select few top officials would brief the king on urgent administrative matters, relay the prevailing public opinion, and negotiate immediate actions.
And the Jokum was the opposite.
Very much so. The Jokum were massive, highly ritualized events in the main courtyard, involving hundreds of officials lined up strictly by rank. It was a visual representation of the entire bureaucratic hierarchy.
Reinforcing the order and structure mandated by the Kejungkuk Keijan.
Exactly.
So, if we look at the government as a modern corporation, the king is the CEO, and the state council acts as the board of directors. They debate the grand strategy, they advise the chief executive, and they steer the overall direction of the ship.
That's a solid analogy.
But beneath them is the executive engine that actually does the heavy lifting. This brings us down to the next tier of the administration, the 6 ministries, known as the Yukjo.
The 6 ministries are the operational core of the Joseon state. If the Yujongbu is the board of directors, the Yukjo are the C-suite executives.
They execute the policy.
They are the chief administrative body, operating directly under the oversight of the state council and the king.
And looking at how these 6 silos were divided tells you everything you need to know about what this society valued. The most powerful, holding the highest prestige, was the Ministry of Personnel, the Ijo.
Oh, without a doubt.
Their mandate was the recruitment, appointment, evaluation, promotion, and dismissal of all civil officials across the entire country.
They are the human resources department, but with a level of leverage that is hard to overstate. Because Joseon was a bureaucratic state, your life, your family status, and your wealth were entirely dependent on your government rank.
And the Ministry of Personnel controlled that rank.
They controlled it all. They also managed the civil service examinations. Consequently, the Ijo acted as the ultimate gatekeeper. If a particular political faction managed to secure control of the Ministry of Personnel, they could systematically fill the government with their allies and block their rivals from advancing.
Right below them is the Ministry of Taxation, the Hojo. They are the CFOs.
Money guys.
They managed the national census, controlled the vast public granaries, dictated agricultural policies, and handled the collection of land taxes, which were usually paid in grain or cloth, not currency.
Then we come to the Ministry of Rights, the Yeho.
Now, this is the one that trips up modern observers. Ministry of Rights sounds like a niche department that just organizes parades or plans royal weddings.
Yeah.
But in a Neo-Confucian state, this ministry is incredibly powerful, isn't it?
It is foundational to the very legitimacy of the state. In Neo-Confucianism, proper adherence to ritual is what separates a civilized society from barbarians.
So it's not just party planning.
No, the Yejo managed all state ceremonies, royal weddings, and the crucial ancestral rites. But their power extended much further. They oversaw the entire national education system, including the Royal Academy.
And diplomacy, right.
Perhaps most importantly, they handled all diplomatic protocol and foreign relations, particularly the highly sensitive existential tributary relationship with Ming and later King China.
It's a high-stakes job.
Mismanaging a ritual greeting with a Chinese envoy could literally lead to an invasion. The Yejo managed the state's identity and its survival on the international stage.
Following the Ministry of Rights, we have the Ministry of Military Affairs, the Byongjo. They handled the drafting of soldiers, the management of weapons armories, the postal relay stations, and the deployment of troops.
The Defense Department?
Then the Ministry of Punishments, the Hayeongjo, which served as the highest court of law, managing prisons, reviewing death penalty cases, and administering justice.
The Judiciary arm.
Finally, the Ministry of Public Works, the Gangjo. They were the engineers and artisans, overseeing palace construction, repairing infrastructure like roads and bridges, and managing the state-run manufacturing workshops.
And the internal hierarchy within each of these 6 ministries was uniform across the board. The top official was the minister, the panseo, holding a senior second rank.
He's the boss of that silo.
He was the ultimate authority within his silo. Directly beneath him was the deputy minister, the champan, holding a junior second rank.
And then the secretary.
The secretary, the chamui, a senior third rank, and beneath this executive trio were hundreds of lower-ranking scribes, clerks, and functionaries.
The sources provide a really vivid visual detail here. All of these government offices were physically clustered together on a massive thoroughfare called Yukjo Street,
The Street of the 6 Ministries.
which corresponds directly to present-day Gwanghwamin Plaza in central Seoul. You can imagine the daily chaos there. Hundreds of clerks physically running between these massive wooden compounds, carrying the mountains of paper and reports required to keep the administration functioning.
It was the beating heart of the bureaucracy.
But looking at this system, I see a potential flaw. Having 6 distinct, highly specialized silos makes sense on an organizational chart. But how did it function when reality hit? Suppose the king decides he needs to build a new fortress in the north to defend against Jurchen raiders. How does that policy actually move through the Yukjo?
It requires a staggering amount of interministerial coordination, and that was entirely by design. The system was meticulously engineered to prevent any single ministry from acting unilaterally.
Walk us through that fortress scenario.
All right, the king issues the order. The Ministry of Public Works, the Gangjo, is responsible for the architectural design and the physical construction. but they do not have the labor or the money.
So they have to go knocking on the other doors.
They do. They must formally request the Ministry of Taxation, the Hojo, to allocate the grain to feed the workers and fund the materials.
And the worker.
They have to coordinate with the Ministry of Military Affairs, the Bayangjo, to draft the local peasant conscripts who will actually build it, and to supply the soldiers who will garrison it.
That's already 3 ministries involved.
And the Ministry of Personnel, the Ijo, has to formally appoint a commander for the new fortress. Even the Ministry of Rights, the Yijo, gets involved to divine an auspicious date to break ground. Every ministry has a veto point.
That is a phenomenal check against tyranny. It prevents a rogue minister of military affairs from just deciding to build a private stronghold or start a border war on a whim. He literally cannot feed or supply his troops without the explicit cooperation of 3 other ministries.
It is the ultimate safeguard against military coups, which is why Joseon was a fundamentally civilian-led state. But there is a severe consequence to this design.
Crippling bureaucratic gridlock.
Exactly. Because consensus, constant written communication, and formal consultation were mandated by law, the system was incredibly slow. In times of stability, this was fine. But during a crisis, say, a sudden regional famine, the rigidity was fatal.
Because the grain cannot just be released.
Right. The local magistrate begs for emergency relief. The request travels to Hanyang. The Ministry of Taxation has to audit the request.
Then the Ministry of Rights might debate the ceremonial implications of opening the royal reserves.
The State Council has to deliberate. Weeks could pass in a flurry of paperwork on Yuksho Street while peasants of the provinces were starving. The system provided unparalleled institutional stability, but it completely sacrificed agility.
That brings us to a crucial element of this government, perhaps the most notable part of the deep dive. We have these executives in the 6 ministries wielding vast power over taxes, armies, and laws. Who is auditing them?
The internal watchdog.
Right. Who ensures the CFO isn't skimming the grain tax, or that the king himself isn't violating the Kijiguk Taijon? This brings us to the 3 offices, known collectively as the Samsa.
The Samsa is a brilliant piece of statecraft. It consisted of 3 distinct bodies: the Office of the Inspector General, the Sajbu, the Office of Censors, the Saganwan, and the Office of Special Advisors, the Hongmengguan.
Together, they formed an institutionalized, legally protected system of whistleblowing, moral oversight, and relentless critique.
To understand the Samsa, we have to look at the people who staffed it. These officials were known as the Tagan. And what stands out in the sources is that these were not the grizzled, decades-long veterans of the State Council.
They were young, right?
Relatively young, lower-ranking officials, yet they possessed a specific kind of power that made the highest-ranking ministers terrified of them.
Where does that power come from if they were low-ranking?
They derived their power not from their rank, but from their unassailable moral and academic purity. To even be considered for a position in the Samsa, your background was subjected to an invasive, exhaustive review.
Like a modern background check.
Even stricter, they checked your lineage back multiple generations. If your great-grandfather had been impeached for a minor corruption charge, you were disqualified.
Just for a great-grandfather.
Yes. If you were the child of a concubine, no matter how brilliant you were excluded. The Tagan had to be the elite of the elite in terms of scholarship, family standing, and ethical reputation. They had to be beyond reproach so that their critiques could not be dismissed as hypocrisy.
Let's break down their specific mandates. The Office of the Inspector General, the Sajbu, functioned as the Internal Affairs Division. They actively monitored all government officials, up to the high state councilors, for any sign of corruption, embezzlement, or simple incompetence.
They were the police for the politicians.
And the Office of Special Advisors, the Hongmengguan, maintained the royal library, drafted critical state documents, and acted as an intellectual think tank for the monarch.
Right.
But it's the Office of Censors, the Saganwan, that completely alters how you view this government. Their explicit legal job description was to remonstrate with the king.
To correct him.
If the king issued a decree that they felt violated Confucian morality or historical precedent, their job was to march up to him and demand he withdraw it.
And they did not hold back. The annals are full of instances where the censors relentlessly badgered a monarch, rejecting his decrees day after day, refusing to back down until the king relented. Furthermore, the Samsa participated in the Ganyan, the daily royal lectures.
I want to focus on those lectures.
Yeah.
The king having to sit through daily classes with these young scholars.
The Gyeongyeon were ostensibly philosophical seminars. The king and the special advisors would read from the Confucian classics like Mencius, the Analects, historical chronicles, but these were never purely academic book clubs.
They were political.
Deeply, inherently political. When a young, brilliant special advisor chose to focus a lecture on a historical tyrant whose oppressive taxation led to a peasant revolt, he was not just giving a history lesson.
He's sending a message.
He was looking directly at the king and delivering a scathing critique of the current Ministry of Taxation's policies. The Taegan used these daily mandatory sessions to guide, mold, and sometimes subtly manipulate the king's decision-making process.
Okay, I have to stop here and look at the human element. The theory is that the king welcomes this feedback because he wants to be a sage ruler. But kings are human beings.
Very human.
If I am the absolute monarch and a 25-year-old censor is standing in front of my court telling me that my new military policy is a moral abomination, my human instinct is to call the guards and have him thrown in a cell. What actually protects these young scholars from a king who simply does not want to hear that he is wrong?
In theory, they were protected by the immense institutional prestige of their office and the overarching Neo-Confucian ideology. A king who executed his critics was immediately branded a tyrant by history.
Which was a powerful deterrent.
It was. Historians point out that because the Samsa was so powerful and independent, Joseon never experienced the rise of the manipulative unit classes that frequently plagued and eventually destroyed Chinese dynasties. The scholars acted as an immune system, constantly attacking any concentration of unchecked power in the palace.
That is the theory. But what happens when the immune system attacks the host? When theory meets reality?
In reality, the occupational hazard of being a Taegan was incredibly high. When a monarch, or a dominant political faction, decided they had endured enough of the Samsa's moral grandstanding, the result was catastrophic.
Okay, pushback.
It frequently led to massive, violent political purges known in Korean history as sawa, or literati purges.
Give me an example of the brake lines being cut.
Consider King Seo in the mid-15th century. He was a ruthless pragmatist who usurped the throne from his young nephew. The scholars of the Hall of Worthies, which was the precursor to the Office of Special Advisors, were deeply opposed to this illegal seizure of power.
Because it violated Confucian principles.
Exactly. In 1456, several key officials of the Hall, who became known as the Six Martyred Ministers, plotted to assassinate Seijo and restore the rightful king.
They moved from philosophical critique to armed treason.
They felt it was their moral duty. But the plot was discovered. King Seijo executed them in brutal fashion, and he was so infuriated by the scholars' defiance that he entirely abolished the Hall of Worthies.
Just wiped out the institution.
He recognized that this institution of intellectual oversight was a direct threat to his physical grip on power. Decades later, King Yeongsangun, who was widely regarded as the most tyrannical ruler of the dynasty, went even further.
What did he do?
He engaged in massive purges, executing dozens of scholars, and eventually eliminated the Office of Censors and the Office of Special Advisors completely. He viewed their very existence as an intolerable insult to his absolute authority.
So to be a member of the Samsa was to walk a razor's edge. You possessed the prestige to halt the machinery of state. You were on a fast track to the highest ministerial positions. But you also went to work every day knowing that if you pushed the wrong king too far, you and your entire family could face exile or execution.
High risk, high reward.
Let's shift our perspective. We have talked extensively about the theories of oversight, the grand councils, and the moral lectures. But let's look at the physical, tactile reality of the palace.
The logistics of power.
Right. If you are the king, you are surrounded by the state council demanding consensus, and the censors yelling at you about morality. But who physically controls the pieces of paper reaching your desk? And when you finally give an order, who enforces it with drawn swords?
Now we transition from the deliberative organs to the mechanisms of information flow and state security. The absolute bottleneck for all royal communication was the Royal Secretariat, the Sungingun.
According to the administrative code, the secretariat consisted of 6 royal secretaries, each directly corresponding to one of the 6 ministries.
Right, they mirrored the Yupjo.
They were the singular, exclusive channel through which the king's edicts were transmitted outward to the government, and the only channel through which petitions, reports, and memorials flowed inward to the throne.
And that physical proximity to the king gave the Secretariat immense practical power. The chief royal secretary, the one who handled the Ministry of Personnel and managed the king's daily schedule, was arguably more influential on a day-to-day basis than the chief state counselor.
Because he's the ultimate gatekeeper.
Exactly. If a provincial governor sent an regent report about a famine, the chief royal secretary decided when, how, and even if the king saw that report. They could frame the information, summarize it, or bury it entirely.
There is a highly illustrative historical vignette that perfectly captures the danger of this proximity. It involves a man named Hong Guk-young, operating in the late 18th century during the reign of King Jeongjo.
A classic case of overreach.
The sources show that Hong started as a brilliant young scholar and became the royal tutor and fiercely loyal confidant to Jeongjo before he ever ascended the throne.
Hong Guk-young protected the young prince during a highly volatile, dangerous period of succession. Because of this, when Jeongjo finally became king, his trust in Hong was absolute.
He owed him his life.
He did. Jeongjo appointed Hong as the chief royal secretary. But he didn't stop there. He also appointed Hong as the commander of the royal guards.
So this one man controls all the information going into the king's brain and all the physical muscle protecting the king's body.
It is an unprecedented concentration of power. Hong Guk-young essentially bypassed the entire Ujeongbu and the 6 ministries. Ministers had to go through Hong to get anything done. He became a shadow king.
He had all the levers of power.
He grew so ambitious that he attempted to solidify his bloodline with the royal family by having his own sister enter the palace as King Jeongjo's concubine, hoping she would give birth to the heir.
But the plan failed tragically, right?
Right.
His sister died shortly after entering the palace. Yet Hong's desire for control remained insatiable.
He couldn't stop.
He overreached, attempting to manipulate the succession further, and the king, who was highly intelligent and realized his trusted friend had become a liability, was forced to expel him from the court. Hong died in exile just a few years later.
It is a stark reminder that all the formal structures of the Kidingguk Taijin could be circumvented by someone who simply managed to monopolize the king's ear.
And you touched on the other half of that equation, physical muscle. While the king had to negotiate with the bureaucracy for policy, he needed enforcement mechanisms that reported directly to him, completely bypassing the slow, deliberative state council.
Because when there was a direct threat to the throne, he couldn't wait for the Ministry of Military Affairs to coordinate with the Ministry of Taxation.
He needed dedicated security forces. The sources outline 3 primary bodies that form this royal security apparatus. First is the Pudosha.
The police agency.
Yeah, this functioned as the primary police. It was divided into left and right sectors, maintaining public order and arresting criminals primarily within the capital city of Hanyang and the immediate surrounding Gyeonggi province.
The production dealt with conventional crime. Thieves, smugglers, public disturbances. But for matters of state security, the king relied on the Uigunbu, the Royal Investigation Bureau.
The secret police.
Essentially, yes. This was an investigative and enforcement organ under the direct, exclusive command of the monarch. The Uigunbu did not investigate petty theft.
What was their jurisdiction?
Treason, rebellion, and serious crimes involving high-ranking government officials or members of the royal family. If a powerful member of the state council was accused of plotting a coup, the regular Ministry of Punishments wouldn't touch him.
Too politically sensitive.
Right. It was the heavily armed interrogators of the Uigunbu who would execute the arrest, conduct the often brutal interrogations, and carry out the sentences.
Finally, you have the inner ring of physical protection, the Naijumwi, the royal guards. This was a highly trained, elite military unit numbering anywhere from 60 to 300 men, tasked specifically with the physical protection of the king and the inner palace grounds.
And the kings of Joseon were acutely aware that palace coups were a constant historical threat. They needed to ensure these guards were perpetually vigilant.
There is a fascinating operational detail regarding how they maintained this readiness. In the center of the capital, there was a massive drum and bell system, most notably the Cheobjong bell.
Yes, the chow.
The sources say the king would utilize this bell for random, unannounced tactical inspections. You have to picture the scene. It is a quiet afternoon in the palace, officials are writing reports, and suddenly, the massive, deep tolling of the Cheobjong bell echoes across the entire compound.
It's the designated signal that the king is immediately approaching the main gate.
And the reaction had to be instantaneous. Every single member of the Naijumwi had to drop whatever they were doing, grab their weapons, sprint to the main courtyard, and fall into precise tactical formation.
The king would emerge and personally command them to display their combat proficiency.
They would run live action drills.
They would engage in mock battles right there in the courtyard. They'd demonstrate how they would repel a sudden cavalry charge or an infantry assault on the king's position.
And the king is just watching this play out.
He would watch intently. At the conclusion of the drill, he would publicly express his satisfaction, handing out rewards, or his extreme displeasure, which could result in immediate demotions or punishments for the guard commanders.
Talk about keeping them on their toes.
It was a visceral reminder to everyone in the palace that while the scholars debated morality in the halls, the king still commanded the swords in the courtyard.
If we pull back and synthesize this, we see a deliberate strategy. The king allows the state council and the 6 ministries to govern the vast, slow-moving agrarian nation.
But he keeps his own leverage.
He purposefully keeps the 2 most critical levers of survival, the control of raw information through the Secretariat, and the capacity for immediate violence through the Investigation Bureau and the guards, tightly gripped in his own hands. We have spent a lot of time analyzing the architecture of this bureaucracy, the councils, the watchdogs, the ministries. But we need to explore how a human being actually gained entry into this fortress of power. How did a Joseon citizen get a job?
It's a grueling process.
Let's transition to what I view as the crucible of the entire dynasty. Let's talk about blood, sweat, and exams, the Gwagyo system.
The Gwagyo were the national civil service examinations. If you desired a position of meaningful rank, power, or influence in the Joseon government, passing the Gwagyo was not just an option. It was the sole legitimate pathway.
There was no backdoor.
The statutory law was uncompromising. High administrative office was categorically closed to anyone who did not pass this exam, with only rare exceptions for the sons of the absolute highest-ranking merit subjects.
The system was divided into 3 broad categories, each testing a different skill set. The most prestigious, by a massive margin, was the literary examination, the Mungwa.
That was the golden ticket.
This was the fast track to the State Council and the Samsa. It tested advanced composition, poetry, and a deep encyclopedic mastery of the Chinese Confucian classics. Then you had the military examination, the Mugwa, for military officers.
And the technical side.
Finally, the miscellaneous examinations, the Chopgwa, which tested the necessary technical subjects like medicine, translation for foreign diplomacy, cartography, and accounting.
Focusing on the literary exams, the sheer rigor of the process is difficult for a modern mind to grasp. The regular exams, known as the Sinyansi, were held only once every 3 years.
So if you fail, you wait a long time.
It was an agonizing gauntlet consisting of 3 distinct stages.
Walk us through what a candidate had to endure.
First, you had the provincial exams. Thousands of scholars from across the peninsula would gather in designated testing compounds. They would be locked inside for days, writing complex essays under strict surveillance to prevent cheating.
Just to pass the first hurdle.
Only a tiny fraction passed the stage. Those survivors traveled to Hanyang for the second stage, the capital examination, which was even more grueling. Finally, the handful of men who passed that stage advanced to the palace examination.
This is the 3rd stage, held in the physical presence of the king himself.
Yes. The king would personally pose the final essay question, often concerning a complex matter of current state policy or moral philosophy.
No pressure.
The candidates would write the responses, and the king, alongside his top ministers, would personally grade and rank the successful candidates. Your final ranking in this specific exam dictated your starting position in the bureaucracy and the trajectory of your entire career.
Now here's where I feel compelled to challenge the popular narrative. The administrative codes state that theoretically, the Gwagyo was an open system. Any freeborn male, anyone who was not part of the lowest enslaved class known as the Nobi, was legally permitted to sit for the examinations.
That's what the law said, yes.
On paper, this sounds like a beautiful, progressive meritocracy. But let's look at the reality. To pass this exam, a boy had to begin memorizing archaic Chinese characters at the age of 4. He had to study intensively for 10 to 20 years.
It required total dedication.
If only the wealthy aristocratic class, the Yangban, had the vast financial resources to allow their sons to study literature for 2 decades without ever needing to work in the fields to generate income, wasn't this entire system just a hereditary aristocracy masquerading behind an entrance exam?
That is the fundamental contradiction of the Joseon state. It was a door technically open to the public, but realistically only one specific class could afford the immense toll to walk through it. The reality is exactly as you described. The Yangban nobility almost entirely monopolized the civil service.
They rigged the game, essentially.
However, we cannot let that monopoly blind us to the intense, crushing psychological pressure this system exerted internally upon those very same Yangban families.
Expand on that pressure. If they already hold all the wealth and the land, and they are recognized as nobles, why are they stressed about a test?
Because in Joseon society, your status as a noble was not permanently guaranteed by your bloodline alone. The law was ruthless. If a Yangban family failed to produce a government official who passed the Guagyo for 4 consecutive generations, they lost their nobility.
Wait, the entire family gets demoted?
Completely. They would be stripped of their Yangban status and legally demoted to commoners. They would lose their political privileges, their social standing, and eventually their economic protections. 4 generations of failing a test meant the annihilation of the family's legacy.
That reframes everything. It explains why education wasn't just a pursuit of enlightenment. It was the absolute, desperate center of their universe.
Entire family fortunes were poured into private tutors and local academies known as Seoan. The Royal Academy in the capital, the Sungshinkwan, was a high-pressure cooker geared entirely toward preparing the most promising students for this single triennial event.
And the odds were terrible.
The statistical bottleneck was terrifying. Over the entire span of the dynasty's 600 years, the civil service selected roughly 14,600 candidates in the highest literary exams. Think about that. In a nation of millions, over 6 centuries, only 14,000 men passed.
With stakes that high and a bottleneck that narrow, corruption is inevitable. And the sources point out how the Guaigyo system eventually fostered intense regionalism and factional bias.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the examiners were high-ranking officials from specific political factions, scholars from rival factions or from regions out of favor with the court would routinely be failed, regardless of their merit.
It became incredibly partisan.
In response, scholars from entire provinces might boycott the exam and protest. Conversely, the data from the late Joseon period shows bizarre anomalies. We see a massive disproportionate spike in successful candidates coming from the northern province of Pyongan.
Right, the Cheongju anomaly.
Specifically, one relatively small county, Cheongju, started producing more successful exam candidates than the capital itself.
Which is a glaring red flag indicating the system is breaking down. When one remote northern county suddenly dominates the most rigorous national exam, it is not because they suddenly developed a superior study method.
No, it means the fix is in.
It indicates that the meritocracy has been fatally compromised. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, the Guagyo was plagued by leaked test papers, surrogate test takers, rampant bribery, and blatant regional favoritism.
That must have caused huge resentment.
It bred deep, bitter frustration among thousands of brilliant scholars who studied honestly for decades but realized they could not buy their way into the system.
Up to this point, our deep dive has been heavily focused on the capital, Hanyang. We have analyzed the king, the central ministries, the royal guards, and the royal academies. But to truly understand this government, we have to expand our lens outward.
Look at the rest of the country.
How did this massive central apparatus actually project its power, collect its taxes, and enforce its laws across the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Korean Peninsula? Let's turn our attention to local government.
The physical administrative geography of Joseon remained remarkably stable, which is a testament to the system's design. For the vast majority of the dynasty, the peninsula was divided into 8 provinces, or do.
And they lasted a long time.
If you look at a map from 1413 and compare it to a map from 1895, the provincial boundaries are largely unchanged.
Below those 8 provinces, the land was subdivided into municipalities of varying sizes and importance, classified as Bu, Mok, Gun, and Haian. In total, there were roughly 330 of these local districts scattered across the country.
Right.
Now, this is where Joseon makes a major defining departure from the previous Goryeo dynasty. During Goryeo, the central government only had the resources to send officials to the major provincial capitals. They allowed local hereditary lords to manage the smaller rural villages, collected taxes, and maintain private armies.
Joseon eradicated that system entirely. Centralization was the ultimate goal.
They set their own guys.
The government in Hanyang dispatched appointed civil officials to supervise every single one of those 330 districts, no matter how small or remote. They legally abolished the system of subordinate local lords and private armies.
So local power was crushed.
The magistrate, sitting in the smallest rural Heian, did not answer to a neighboring wealthy landowner. He answered directly to the provincial governor, who answered directly to the Ministry of Personnel in Hanyang.
But the central government knew they had a communication problem. If you send a magistrate to a remote district in the southern provinces, it takes weeks for a message to reach the capital.
It's a huge blind spot.
How does the king know that this magistrate is actually following the Kijunguk Taijun and not just acting like a tyrant, embezzling the grain tax and taking bribes?
To solve this, the king utilized one of the most distinct and dramatic tools in the entire Joseon administrative arsenal, the secret royal inspector, or Amhangyosa.
The institution of the secret royal inspector is arguably one of the most compelling mechanisms of accountability in pre-modern history. When the king suspected mismanagement in a province, or simply wanted an unvarnished look at the realities of rural life, he would secretly appoint a young, trusted, lower-ranking official, often from the Samsa, to travel incognito and audit the local administration.
The narrative of the secret inspector's journey reads like a historical thriller.
It really does. The process begins in the palace. The chosen inspector is called before the king and handed a pongsa. This is a heavily sealed letter of appointment.
And he can't open it.
Right. The inspector is strictly forbidden from opening this letter or revealing his mission to anyone, including his own family, until he is physically outside the gates of the capital. He's also handed a mappe.
The mappe is a bronze medallion engraved with horses. It was the absolute badge of royal authority. It allowed the bearer to requisition horses and personnel from the state-run relay stations. But the inspector would hide this medallion deep in his robes.
Because he travels in disguise. You have to picture this elite, highly educated young aristocrat putting on the ragged clothes of a wandering, impoverished scholar, or even a beggar.
Completely blending in.
He travels on foot through the rural districts. He sleeps in the dirt floor taverns. He listens to the rumors of the peasants. He inspects the physical state of the crops to see if the reported harvest matches reality.
He's doing field intelligence.
And he quietly, methodically gathers evidence of corruption. Maybe a magistrate hoarding grain during a famine or accepting bribes to issue unjust legal rulings.
He is compiling an ironclad dossier, and when he has gathered enough evidence of severe dereliction of duty, he initiates the climax of his mission, the Chuldu.
The reveal.
The inspector marches directly into the local government courtyard, usually while the corrupt magistrate is holding court. He throws off his disguise, pulls out the mappe, and shouts, "The secret royal inspector has arrived."
The panic in that courtyard must have been incredible.
Yeah. It was absolute terror for a corrupt official. The inspector possessed terrifying, immediate authority. He could instantly execute a pongo.
Which means?
This meant physically sealing the government storehouses and the public assets, ensuring the magistrate couldn't destroy evidence or flee with the treasury. He effectively suspended the magistrate's powers on the spot.
And he didn't just punish the officials. He actively fixed the damage. The sources describe the Isachigim.
The Isachigim was an immediate on-site retrial. If the inspector found that the magistrate had unjustly imprisoned a local farmer to seize his land, the inspector had the authority to pull that farmer out of the cell, reverse the judgment, and return the land that very day.
Immediate justice.
The secret inspector functioned as the king's eyes, ears, and hands, completely bypassing the massive, slow-moving hierarchy of the provincial governors and the six ministries to deliver sudden, terrifying justice.
While we are talking about these local districts, there is a detail in the sources regarding Korean administrative culture that I found profoundly strange at first, but deeply fascinating once I understood it. The Joseon government did not just assign bureaucratic ranks to human beings. They granted official legal ranks to the physical land itself.
This is a vital point that highlights the underlying cultural philosophy of the state. It is true. Every municipality, every gun and Heian, possessed an official rank, ranging from junior 6th rank all the way up to junior 2nd rank.
To a modern listener, the idea of assigning a human job title to a patch of dirt seems absurd. Why do this?
Because in their worldview, the distinction between organic entities like humans and inorganic entities like mountains and rivers was much more fluid. This practice stems directly from a cultural perception of the land as a living, breathing entity.
Connected to Feng Shui.
Deeply intertwined with the principles of Feng Shui, or Pongsu in Korean, the land possessed energy, history, and character.
Which implies that a municipality could literally be promoted or demoted, just like a person.
Exactly. If a local district produced a famous, virtuous scholar, or if its residents displayed exceptional loyalty during an invasion, the king could officially promote the district to a higher rank.
And that brought real benefits.
It brought tangible benefits: lower tax quotas, higher prestige, and a higher-ranking magistrate. Conversely, if a district was the site of a treasonous rebellion, or if its residents committed heinous crimes, the land itself was deemed polluted.
So they demote the land.
The king would officially demote the municipality. It would lose its status, and its residents would suffer increased burdens. It demonstrates a profound, almost spiritual attachment to the physical geography of the state. The administration governed the land, and the land responded.
We have spent this deep dive painting a picture of a remarkably durable, highly structured system. We have the 6 ministries executing the laws, the 3 offices acting as fearless auditors, the Guagio filtering the talent pool, and the secret inspectors keeping the remote provinces in line. It seems like a perfectly balanced machine.
On the surface, yes.
But as we move toward the conclusion of our analysis, we have to examine the tragic irony of this dynasty. We have to look at how the very structures designed to create a perfectly balanced, perpetual state ultimately led to its stagnation and its collapse.
The narrative arc of Joseon is a cautionary tale of institutional rigidity. The system's greatest strength, its unwavering adherence to precedent, structure, and intense Neo-Confucian moral debate, eventually became its fatal flaw.
It turned inward.
The culture of relentless scholarly critique, fostered by the Samsa and the daily royal lectures, eventually metastasized. It birthed massive, entrenched, bitterly divided political factions.
The sources outline the evolution of these factions. It starts with the division between the Easterners and the Westerners in the late 16th century, which later splinters into the Noron and Sauron factions, among others.
It got very complex.
Now, it is crucial to understand that these were not political parties in the modern sense, debating different tax brackets or infrastructure spending.
No, they were uncompromising ideological camps. They believed that their interpretation of Confucian morality was the only path to state survival, and any opposing view was not just incorrect, but evil. Because of this, they weaponized the very mechanisms of government against each other.
They took the Samsa, the Inspector General, and the censors, which were designed to check the king's morality, and turned them into a political firing squad.
Precisely. If the Noron faction gained control of the censorate, they didn't use it to critique the king. They used it to relentlessly impeach, exile, or demand the execution of every minister belonging to the Sauron faction.
They paralyzed the state council.
In the late 17th century, the government spent years gridlocked in bitter, vicious debates over the exact duration of royal mourning rituals, like should the Queen Dowager wear mourning clothes for 1 year or 3 years.
While ignoring real problems.
They completely ignored glaring existential structural problems in the agricultural economy and the military while having these debates.
It is a profound tragedy. An administrative system built entirely around the idealized concept of scholarly debate, ethical governance, and the pursuit of truth descended into paralyzing gridlock and violent purges, precisely because the rules were too inflexible to accommodate compromise.
They were so busy arguing over the texts of the past that they failed to prepare for the future. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this bureaucratic rigidity actively suppressed innovation.
Whereas the reform movement, though, right?
Yes, there was a movement called Silhak, or practical learning, championed by forward-thinking scholars who wanted to reform agriculture, encourage trade, and adopt new technologies.
But the system rejected them. The ministries, particularly the Ministry of Public Works and the Ministry of Military Affairs, failed to adapt.
The curriculum of the Guageo exams remained stubbornly locked on ancient Chinese philosophy. While the rest of the world was undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steamships, and modernizing their militaries with new firearms, the Joseon bureaucracy was still relying on military structures and revenue models designed in the 15th century.
And this institutional stagnation left the state devastatingly vulnerable to the aggressive forces of 19th century imperialism. The pressure finally snapped the machine. The breaking point arrived in 1894 with the Gabo reforms.
The Joseon state was facing intense simultaneous pressure. Internally, the massive Dunghak peasant rebellion was threatening to topple the government due to rampant corruption and crushing taxation.
And externally.
Externally, the increasingly modernized and aggressive Japanese empire was exerting overwhelming influence over the peninsula. Under this extreme duress, the old system was finally forcefully dismantled.
The Gabo reforms systematically dismantled the world we have just spent an hour describing. They officially abolished the Guajio civil service examinations, finally ending the centuries-long Yangban monopoly on administrative
A
office.
huge shift.
They dissolved the traditional six ministries, the Yukjo, and the State Council, the Ujeonbu.
In their place, they established a modern cabinet system featuring 8 specialized ministries modeled heavily on contemporary Western and Japanese administrative structures. Ranks were untethered from the ancient class system. The 500-year-old machine, dictated by the Kingguk Taejon, was permanently turned off.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it is incredibly easy to look at the fall of Joseon, the factional gridlock, and the vulnerability to imperialism, and conclude that this system was a failure. It is tempting to dismiss it as a rigid dinosaur that simply could not adapt to a changing world.
It is easy to focus on the collapse, but if we pull back and evaluate the totality of the dynasty, we have to acknowledge the staggering, undeniable legacy of the Ijeonbu, the 6 ministries, and the Samsa. We must evaluate a government by its durability.
It did last a very long time.
This specific administrative framework successfully governed a vast, complex agrarian society for 5 centuries. It sustained the nation through apocalyptic external shocks, most notably the devastating Japanese invasions of the 1590s, which burned Hanyang to the ground, and the Manchu invasions of the 1630s.
Not to mention the natural disasters.
It managed countless droughts, floods, and famines, and it did all of this without suffering a major dynastic collapse for half a millennium.
500 years of continuous governance operating under a single constitutional framework, the Kingguk Taejon, is a feat of institutional durability that very few states in human history have ever achieved.
It represents a monumental triumph of civilian bureaucratic rule over feudal fragmentation. While Europe was still struggling with warring regional lords, Joseon established a centralized standard of public record-keeping, legal codification, and meritocratic aspiration that was virtually unparalleled in its era.
Which brings us to a compelling connection to the present day. You might look at modern South Korea and think the world of the Joseon court is entirely dead. The dynasty ended in the late 19th century.
It seems like ancient history.
The grand wooden palaces on Yukjo Street are now tourist sites, surrounded by modern glass skyscrapers, where actors wear colorful robes and reenact the tolling of the Cheobjeon bell for cameras. But the bureaucratic DNA of Joseon did not vanish when the Gabo reforms were signed. The physical buildings changed, but the culture remained.
The foundational concepts of Joseon statecraft, the absolute reliance on rigorous, highly centralized entrance examinations to identify talent, the strict vertical hierarchy of specialized ministries, and the deep-seated societal respect for education and administrative authority, these elements heavily influenced the rapid state building of modern South Korea in the 20th century.
If you look closely at the incredibly competitive, high-stakes civil service examinations that millions of young people take in the Republic of Korea today, or if you analyze the intensely hierarchical, department-driven structure of modern Korean corporate conglomerates and government agencies, you are not looking at something entirely new.
No, you are looking at the ghost of the Guajio. You are hearing the distant echo of the Kingguk Taejon.
It proves a fundamental historical truth that we see time and time again. The physical empires will inevitably fall. The royal bloodlines will fade into history. The specific laws will be rewritten.
But a deeply ingrained administrative culture, the way a society fundamentally organizes itself and defines merit, endures for centuries.
So the next time you find yourself interacting with a massive, complex, modern organization, and you catch yourself wondering why on earth it requires 6 different specialized departments, 3 rounds of internal audits, and months of debate just to approve a single, simple decision, take a moment to remember the thousands of invisible gears turning in the Joseon court.
The king and the crank may be gone,
But the intricate machine they built is still quietly humming beneath the surface. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.